You can survive cancer, Evelyn Walker once said, but sometimes you can't survive the people waiting for you at home. The rain had followed her all the way from St. Mary's Medical Center to her son's neighborhood in Northern Virginia, turning the streets silver under the yellow glow of the streetlights. Evelyn sat quietly in the back seat of the taxi with her hands folded over her purse, staring out the window as families moved through warm kitchens and glowing living rooms. She had been discharged only 3 hours earlier after spending 8 days in the hospital recovering from a serious lung infection. The doctors said she was lucky they caught it in time. At 72 years old, lucky felt like a fragile word. Her breathing still carried a faint whistle every now and then, and the antiseptic scent from the hospital clung lightly to her sweater, no matter how many wipes and lotions she used before leaving. She hated that smell. It reminded her of loss, of waiting rooms, of her husband Richard taking his final breath 5 years earlier while she held his hand beside a humming machine. But tonight wasn't supposed to be sad. Tonight was supposed to be family. Her son Daniel had insisted she come straight to his house after discharge instead of returning to her empty condo. "Mom, Melissa's making pot roast," he had told her over the phone. "Sophie keeps asking when Grandma's coming over." Evelyn had smiled through tears when he said that. Sometimes small kindnesses from your children could still make you feel 20 years younger. The taxi stopped in front of Daniel's large brick house just after 6 o'clock. Christmas lights still lined the roof, even though it was already late January. Melissa liked things to look perfect from the outside. Evelyn paid the driver, thanked him softly, and stepped carefully onto the wet driveway. Her knees ached from the cold. She adjusted her scarf and walked toward the front porch, carrying the small overnight bag Daniel had packed for her at the hospital earlier that afternoon. Before she could knock, the front door swung open. Little Sophie ran toward her first. "Grandma," the 7-year-old squealed, wrapping tiny arms around Evelyn's waist. Evelyn nearly lost her balance, laughing softly as she hugged her granddaughter tightly. "There's my favorite girl," she whispered. Sophie smelled like vanilla shampoo and crayons, the kind of smell that made the world feel safe. Daniel appeared behind her holding a glass of iced tea. "Hey, Mom," he said with a tired smile. He gave her a quick hug, awkward but genuine. "Come inside before you freeze." Warm air rolled over her face as she stepped into the house. The smell of onions, rosemary, and roast beef filled the entryway. Evelyn's stomach tightened with hunger. Hospital food had tasted like cardboard and sadness for over a week. She slipped off her damp shoes beside the door while Sophie grabbed her hand excitedly. "Mommy made pie too," Sophie whispered like it was classified information. Evelyn smiled. "Then I definitely came to the right place." Melissa's voice floated from the dining room before Evelyn even saw her. "Daniel, did you remember to put the sparkling water on the table?" Then Melissa stepped into view wearing a cream-colored sweater dress and gold earrings, perfectly styled like she'd walked out of a home decor magazine. Her smile appeared for exactly half a second. Then her expression changed. Her nose wrinkled slightly, almost instinctively. "Oh," Melissa said softly. Silence followed. Evelyn felt it immediately. That strange shift in the air women understood without words. Melissa looked directly at Daniel, then toward the dining room. "Can someone open a window?" she asked casually. "She smells like a hospital." The entire room froze. Sophie looked confused. Daniel stared down at his drink. Even the grandfather clock near the stairs suddenly seemed louder. Evelyn felt heat rush into her cheeks so quickly she thought she might faint. For one terrible second, she honestly wondered if she had heard wrong. But Melissa was already walking past her toward the kitchen. "I'm just saying," she added lightly. "The smell is really strong." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the handle of her purse. Her heartbeat pounded inside her ears. She became painfully aware of every inch of herself. The clean sweater she had carefully picked. The lavender lotion she applied before discharge. The fresh mint she sucked on in the cab. None of it mattered. Because now all she could think about was the hospital smell. The smell of sickness. The smell of age. The smell of becoming inconvenient. Sophie looked up innocently. "Mommy," she asked quietly, "is Grandma dirty?" Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a tiny invisible fracture somewhere deep beneath years of sacrifices nobody remembered anymore. Melissa immediately forced a laugh. "No, honey, Grandma's not dirty." But the damage was already done. Children repeated truths adults accidentally exposed. Evelyn slowly looked toward Daniel. She waited for him to say something. Anything. Tell Melissa that was cruel. Defend her. Change the subject. Put an arm around her shoulders. But Daniel only rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly and stared toward the kitchen. Maybe we should crack a window for a minute, he mumbled. That was the moment Evelyn stopped feeling like family inside that house. She smiled anyway. Women from her generation learned long ago how to survive humiliation without making noise. Of course, she said softly. Hospitals have a very particular smell. Melissa immediately relaxed as if the situation had been resolved politely. Dinner's almost ready, she chirped from the kitchen. Evelyn sat at the dining table while Sophie colored beside her. But suddenly every sound felt distant. Forks clinking, oven timer buzzing, television murmuring from another room. Her eyes drifted slowly across the house she had helped pay for without anyone at that table fully realizing it. 3 years earlier, Daniel and Melissa nearly lost everything after Daniel's startup collapsed. They were behind on mortgage payments. Credit cards maxed out. Melissa cried on the phone saying they might need to pull Sophie out of private school. Evelyn had quietly written them a check for $180,000 from her retirement savings without hesitation. Family takes care of family, she had told Daniel back then when he cried into her shoulder. Tonight, sitting at that table while cold January air drifted through the cracked kitchen window beside her chair, Evelyn realized something painful. Some people only love the warmth you provided. The second you became associated with weakness, sickness, or inconvenience, they opened windows to let you out. The rest of dinner moved forward like a play where everyone had forgotten their lines, but kept smiling anyway. Evelyn sat near the end of the table beside Sophie while cold air drifted softly from the cracked kitchen window behind her chair. Melissa carried dishes back and forth with exaggerated cheerfulness, talking about school schedules, grocery prices, and a neighbor who had installed a $70,000 outdoor kitchen nobody needed. Daniel mostly nodded while cutting his pot roast into tiny pieces without eating much himself. Every now and then he glanced toward Evelyn with guilt flickering across his face, but never long enough to become courage. Evelyn noticed everything. Age sharpened observation in ways youth never understood. "Grandma," Sophie asked while swinging her legs beneath the chair, "did the hospital hurt?" Melissa immediately jumped in before Evelyn could answer. "Sweetheart, do not ask people medical questions during dinner." Her tone sounded sweet on the surface, but underneath it carried embarrassment. Like Evelyn herself had become an uncomfortable topic sitting in the middle of the table. Evelyn forced a gentle smile toward Sophie. "It is all right, honey. The hospital did not hurt me. The nurses were actually very kind." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Did they give you shots?" "A few." Sophie made a dramatic face. "I would cry." Evelyn laughed softly for the first time that evening. "I almost did too." For a brief moment, warmth returned to the table. Then Melissa opened another window near the dining room because she claimed the roast made the house too hot. January wind slid across Evelyn's neck like ice water. She quietly reached for her sweater collar. Daniel finally noticed. "Maybe close that one," he said carefully. "Mom just got out of the hospital." Melissa did not even look at him. "Fresh air is healthy," she replied while pouring herself sparkling water. "Especially during flu season." Evelyn lowered her eyes toward her plate. She suddenly lost her appetite completely. The pot roast tasted like wet paper now. After dinner, Sophie begged Evelyn to watch her practice piano in the living room. Evelyn happily agreed because children still loved without calculation. Sophie climbed onto the piano bench and played a shaky version of Moon River, while Evelyn applauded after every mistake like it was Carnegie Hall. Daniel stood nearby scrolling through emails on his phone while Melissa cleaned dishes loudly in the kitchen. Every plate she stacked sounded sharper than necessary. Eventually, Sophie ran upstairs to grab a drawing she wanted to show her grandmother. The moment the child disappeared, the warmth disappeared with her. Melissa leaned against the kitchen counter, drying wine glasses, while speaking low enough to sound casual, but loud enough for Evelyn to hear from the living room. "Daniel, did you wash the guest sheets?" she asked. "Your mother was coughing pretty hard earlier." Evelyn stared at the piano keys silently. Daniel sighed. "The doctor said she is not contagious anymore." "Doctors say lots of things," Melissa replied. "I just do not want Sophie getting sick." Evelyn looked down at her hands. Thin skin, blue veins, wedding ring still resting on her finger 5 years after Richard's death because removing it felt too permanent. She remembered all the nights she stayed awake beside Daniel's bed when he had asthma attacks as a child. She remembered sleeping upright in hospital chairs after his appendix burst at 14. She remembered cleaning vomit from sheets, driving through snowstorms for antibiotics, sitting through endless parent-teacher conferences when Daniel struggled after Richard lost his job during the recession. Mothers spent entire lifetimes making sickness feel less frightening for their children. Funny how quickly children forgot that once they grew comfortable enough. Grandma. Sophie came running back downstairs carrying a folded piece of paper covered in crayons. I made this while you were in the hospital. Evelyn smiled warmly as Sophie climbed into her lap. The drawing showed a crooked rainbow above two stick figures holding hands. One had gray hair. That is us. Evelyn asked softly. Sophie nodded proudly. I told Mommy hospitals are scary because they smell sad. Melissa froze for half a second while drying the same glass over and over again. Sophie continued innocently. But I said Grandma does not smell sad. Silence wrapped around the room so tightly even Daniel looked uncomfortable now. Evelyn kissed Sophie's forehead gently. Thank you, sweetheart. Melissa finally forced a laugh. Kids say the funniest things. But Evelyn noticed something else beneath Melissa's smile tonight. Irritation, not guilt. Irritation that the moment had become awkward for her instead of painful for someone else. Around 9 o'clock, Evelyn excused herself to use the downstairs bathroom before heading to bed. Her body still felt exhausted from the hospital stay. Even walking across the house made her lungs ache slightly. As she passed the hallway near the kitchen, she slowed unintentionally when she heard Melissa speaking in a hushed voice. I know, Melissa whispered sharply. But how long is this going to last? Evelyn stopped near the corner without meaning to eavesdrop. Daniel's voice answered quietly. She almost died, Melissa. I understand that, Melissa replied. But this changes things. What things? Daniel sounded tired now. Everything. Sophie getting attached again. Your mother staying longer than planned. Medical issues. Expenses. We were finally getting our life back. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten painfully. She is my mother, Daniel said under his breath. Melissa lowered her voice even more, but Evelyn still heard every word clearly enough. And eventually this house is supposed to become ours completely, Daniel. We both know that. But if her health keeps declining, we are going to end up taking care of her for years. Evelyn stopped breathing for a second. Not from illness. From shock. Melissa continued softly. I just think we need boundaries before emotions start making financial decisions for everybody. Financial decisions. The words echoed through Evelyn's chest like distant thunder. She quietly stepped backward before they could notice her standing. There. Her hand trembled slightly against the hallway wall. Suddenly dozens of small memories rearranged themselves inside her mind into something uglier. Melissa insisting Evelyn move closer after Richard died. Melissa encouraging Sunday family dinners more often after learning about the investment property Richard left behind. Melissa constantly asking vague questions about estate planning disguised as concern. Evelyn slowly returned to the living room where Sophie had fallen asleep sideways across the couch, clutching her crayons. Daniel walked in a moment later looking drained. Mom, are you all right? He asked carefully. Evelyn looked at her son for a long moment. The little boy who once cried because neighborhood kids mocked her old station wagon. The teenager who hugged her after every basketball game win or lose. The grown man who now stood silently while his wife treated his mother like an infection inside her own family. I am just tired, Evelyn answered softly. Daniel nodded with visible relief because tiredness was easier to handle than truth. Later that night, after everyone went upstairs, Evelyn sat alone in the dark guest room staring at the soft glow of snow falling outside the window. She reached into her purse and pulled out the folded bank statement she had received the morning before entering the hospital. $480,000 from the sale of Richard's land in Montana now sat untouched in her account. Money she planned to surprise Daniel with next month. Money meant to secure his future. Money Melissa was already counting in her head before Evelyn was even gone. Evelyn slowly folded the paper again and placed it back inside her purse. Then, for the first time since Melissa's cruel comment at dinner, something inside her changed. The sadness was still there, but now another feeling quietly rose beside it. Clarity. By 6 o'clock the next morning, Evelyn was already awake, sitting silently at the kitchen table while darkness still covered the neighborhood outside. The house felt completely different before everyone else woke up. Peaceful, honest, no forced smiles, no carefully chosen words hiding ugly intentions underneath. Just the soft humming of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock above the coffee machine. Evelyn wrapped both hands around a cup of chamomile tea because the doctors told her caffeine would irritate her lungs during recovery. She barely tasted it anyway. Her thoughts had kept her awake most of the night. Not because of Melissa's comment anymore. Strange enough, that part hurt less now. Cruel people eventually revealed themselves if you gave them enough comfort. What stayed with Evelyn was Daniel's silence. That was the wound she could not stop touching in her mind. At 7 years old, Daniel once punched a fifth grader for making fun of Evelyn's waitress uniform after school. The principal called her into the office, expecting anger. Instead, Daniel stood there crying harder than she had ever seen before. "Nobody talks about my mom like that," he kept saying through tears. She remembered hugging him tightly in the parking lot afterward while trying not to laugh. Back then, he would have defended her against the entire world. Somewhere along the way, adulthood had made him smaller. Around 7:30, footsteps came downstairs. Melissa entered the kitchen wearing expensive cream-colored workout clothes and carrying her phone in one hand. She stopped briefly after seeing Evelyn already awake. "Oh," she said, "you are up early." Evelyn nodded politely. "Hospital schedules ruin your sleep." Melissa opened the refrigerator and grabbed bottled green juice without offering anything else. "Well, hopefully you can rest today." Her tone sounded lighter than the night before, almost overly pleasant now that daylight had returned. People often became kinder after cruelty once they realized witnesses existed. Evelyn watched Melissa scroll through social media while standing beside the kitchen island. Perfect blonde hair, perfect manicure, perfect suburban image. Melissa looked like the kind of woman who posted inspirational quotes online while secretly resenting anyone who interrupted her comfort. "How are you feeling this morning?" Melissa asked without looking up from her phone. "Better," Evelyn answered softly. Melissa nodded absent-mindedly. "That is good. Sophie has dance class later, so the house will be quieter this afternoon." Evelyn recognized the hidden meaning immediately. Melissa was informing her about schedules, about routines, about how temporary guests should fit around established lives. Before Evelyn could respond, Daniel walked downstairs looking exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. He kissed Melissa quickly on the cheek, then poured coffee without speaking much. The tension between husband and wife sat heavily in the room, even without words. Melissa finally grabbed her purse. "I need to run errands before my Pilates class," she announced. "Daniel, please remember to sanitize the upstairs bathroom handles, because Sophie keeps touching everything." Daniel looked embarrassed instantly. "Melissa," he muttered quietly. "What?" "I am being careful." Then she turned toward Evelyn with a bright smile that somehow felt colder than open rudeness. "Do not take it personally. You know how germs are." Evelyn smiled back calmly. "Of course." Melissa left a minute later, heels clicking sharply across hardwood floors before the front door closed behind her. Silence settled through the kitchen again. Daniel stared into his coffee cup for several seconds before finally speaking. "Mom, about last night." Evelyn waited quietly. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Melissa did not mean it the way it sounded. There it was. Not accountability. Not defense. Translation. The language weak people used when truth became uncomfortable. Evelyn folded her hands carefully on the table. How exactly did it sound differently? Daniel sighed heavily. "She has just been stressed lately." Stress makes people honest sometimes. Daniel looked away immediately. Evelyn noticed that too. "Mom, can we not do this?" he asked softly. "Do what?" "Make everything worse." Evelyn almost smiled at the irony. Children often accused parents of creating problems simply by acknowledging them. She looked toward the window where light snow continued falling gently across the backyard. "Do you remember your 10th birthday?" she asked suddenly. Daniel blinked in confusion. "What?" "Your bicycle." Daniel frowned slightly, searching his memory. "The blue Schwinn." Evelyn nodded. "You wanted that bicycle for 8 months." Daniel gave a small, reluctant smile. "Dad said we could not afford it." "We could not." Evelyn looked down at her tea. "So I worked double shifts at the diner for 11 weeks. Daniel's expression changed slowly. "Mom, I remember my feet bleeding after one Saturday because the manager refused to let us sit during busy hours. Evelyn kept her voice calm. But you smiled so hard when you saw that bicycle. I forgot all about the pain. Daniel stared silently now. Evelyn continued softly. That is what parents do. We absorb discomfort so our children can feel safe. Daniel lowered his eyes. Shame finally began creeping across his face. I know you sacrificed a lot. Evelyn studied him carefully. Do you? The question hung between them longer than either expected. Daniel sat down across from her slowly. Melissa is not a bad person, he said after a moment. She just worries about stability. Evelyn almost laughed, but sadness reached her first. Stability? She repeated quietly. Daniel, your wife looked at me yesterday like I was already becoming a burden. That is not fair. No, Evelyn answered softly. It is not. Daniel leaned back heavily. You do not understand how much pressure we are under right now. Then help me understand. Daniel hesitated before speaking. The market has been terrible. My investments lost money this year. Sophie's tuition increased again. The house taxes went up almost $12,000. Evelyn listened quietly. Melissa thinks if anything major happens medically with you. He stopped himself too late. Evelyn finished the sentence in her mind anyway. They were afraid of responsibility. Afraid she might become expensive. Afraid aging would interfere with their lifestyle. Daniel suddenly looked desperate. Mom, I never wanted you feeling unwanted here. Evelyn noticed he said feeling unwanted instead of being unwanted. Important difference. She reached over and touched his hand gently. Daniel, do you know the saddest thing about getting older? He shook his head silently. You stop asking whether people love you. Evelyn's voice remained calm. You start asking whether they love you enough. Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time since she arrived, he looked genuinely emotional. I do love you. Evelyn smiled faintly. I know. Then she slowly stood from the table, carrying her empty teacup toward the sink. But love without courage becomes very fragile. Daniel said nothing after that, because deep down he knew she was right. Later that afternoon, while Daniel drove Sophie to dance class, Evelyn sat alone in the guest room looking through old photos on her phone. Richard smiling beside a fishing boat in Maine. Daniel graduating college. Sophie as a newborn wrapped in pink blankets. Entire lifetimes compressed into glowing rectangles. Then her phone buzzed softly with a notification from First National Bank. Confirmation that the funds from Richard's Montana property sale had officially cleared into her account overnight. $480,000 now fully available. Evelyn stared at the number for a long time. Last month, she imagined surprising Daniel with the money over family dinner. She pictured tears, gratitude, relief, maybe even pride that his parents had still found one final way to help him build a secure future. But now, sitting quietly in that guest room while cold winter lights spilled across the carpet, Evelyn realized something painful. Money did not reveal character. It exposed it. And for the first time in years, Evelyn Walker began wondering whether helping her son again would actually destroy what little dignity she still had left. That evening, snow covered the neighborhood in a quiet layer of white that made every house look softer than the people living inside them. Evelyn stood near the guest room window watching Daniel shovel the driveway under the yellow porch lights, while Melissa sat downstairs laughing at something on television. From a distance, they still looked like a normal American family. Nice house. Smart child. Stable marriage. The kind of family Christmas cards were designed around. But Evelyn had lived long enough to know that appearances were usually expensive costumes people wore to hide emotional debt. Her phone rested beside her on the bed. The bank. Notifications still sat unread at the top of the screen, even though she had already memorized every number attached to it. $480,000. Richard's final major asset. 40 acres of land outside Bozeman, Montana, purchased during the early years of their marriage before anybody realized how valuable that area would eventually become. Richard loved that land. Every summer, they would spend 2 weeks there fishing, grilling steaks over open fire pits, and pretending life moved slower than it actually did. After Richard died, Evelyn could barely look at the property without breaking down. Selling it had taken nearly 3 years of emotional preparation. But she finally convinced herself the money could become something meaningful for Daniel and Sophie. A legacy. A final act of protection from parents who spent their entire lives building safety for the next generation. Now the money felt different. Heavy. Dangerous almost. Evelyn sat slowly on the edge of the bed and remembered the first time Melissa ever mentioned inheritance. It happened 2 years after the wedding during Thanksgiving dinner. Melissa had laughed while helping clear dishes and casually said, "Daniel keeps joking that one day we will inherit your secret fortune." She smiled when she said it, but her eyes stayed fixed on Evelyn's reaction. Back then, Evelyn brushed it off because younger people often joked awkwardly about uncomfortable topics. But over the years, the comments continued. Questions about property values, suggestions about downsizing, conversations disguised as concern. You should really enjoy your retirement while you still can. Big homes become difficult at your age. Estate planning is so important these days. At the time, Evelyn interpreted those conversations as practicality. Now she saw something else underneath them. Inventory. Around 8:30, Daniel knocked softly on the guest room door. "You still awake?" he asked. Evelyn nodded. Daniel stepped inside carrying a folded blanket. "Melissa keeps the thermostat low at night," he explained awkwardly. "Thought you might need this." Evelyn accepted the blanket with a small smile. "Thank you." Daniel lingered near the doorway like someone wanting forgiveness, but not knowing how to request it. "Mom," he finally said quietly, "Melissa has always been intense about cleanliness. Do not let yesterday get stuck in your head." Evelyn studied her son carefully. "You are still trying to convince yourself that happened differently than it did." Daniel sighed. "I am trying to keep peace." "Peace for who?" Daniel rubbed his jaw tiredly. "You know marriage is complicated." Evelyn almost laughed softly. "Daniel, your father and I were married 46 years. Marriage is not complicated. People are." Daniel sat down slowly in the chair near the window. Snow reflected softly against the glass beside him. For a moment, he looked less like a grown man and more like the exhausted college student who used to call home crying during finals week. "Things have been hard financially," he admitted quietly. "Hard enough that your wife looks at me like a future medical bill." Daniel winced. "Please do not say it like that." "Then how should I say it?" He had no answer. Evelyn looked down at the folded blanket in her lap. "Do you remember the condo fire?" she asked suddenly. Daniel frowned in confusion before recognition hit him. "When I was in 8th grade?" Evelyn nodded. "We lost almost everything." Daniel leaned back slowly. "Dad was out of work for months after that." "Yes." Evelyn's eyes drifted toward the snow outside. "Insurance barely covered half the damage. We lived in a motel for 9 weeks." Daniel smiled faintly at the memory. "I thought the motel pool was amazing." Evelyn laughed softly under her breath. "Your father and I skipped meals so you could order pizza during that time." Daniel's smile disappeared. "Mom, parents become magicians." Evelyn continued gently. "We make struggle invisible for our children." Silence filled the room again. Then Daniel quietly asked, "Why are you telling me all this?" Evelyn looked directly at him now. "Because somewhere along the way, you started seeing my existence as weight instead of history." Daniel's face tightened immediately. "That is not true." "Then why did your wife feel comfortable humiliating me in front of your daughter?" Daniel stared at the floor. "And why did you let her?" His breathing slowed heavily. "I do not know," he admitted finally. The honesty surprised both of them. Evelyn nodded slightly. "That answer is at least real." Daniel looked emotionally exhausted now. "You think I am a bad son?" Evelyn's expression softened. "No. I think you became afraid of conflict. And fear changes people slowly until one day they stop recognizing themselves." Downstairs, Melissa's laughter echoed faintly from the television again. Daniel glanced toward the sound instinctively. Evelyn noticed that too. "You love her very much?" she said quietly. Daniel nodded immediately. "I do." "Then tell me honestly," Evelyn asked. "When was the last time you felt respected inside your own marriage?" Daniel froze. Complete silence followed. Evelyn already had her answer before he finally whispered, "I do not know anymore." That sentence changed something for her, because suddenly Melissa made more sense. People who controlled households often depended on everyone else staying emotionally weak. Daniel was not cruel. He was worn down, conditioned into avoiding discomfort at any cost. Melissa did not need to scream to dominate a room. She simply made conflict feel exhausting enough that nobody challenged her anymore. Evelyn slowly stood from the bed. "You should get some sleep," she said gently. Daniel remained seated. "Mom, if Melissa apologizes tomorrow," Evelyn smiled sadly. "An apology only matters when respect exists first." Daniel lowered his head again. Before leaving, he quietly asked, Are you staying long? Evelyn looked at him for several seconds before answering. I have not decided yet. Daniel nodded slowly and left the room. The second the door closed, Evelyn's calm expression faded. Not into anger, into understanding. For years, she believed her greatest responsibility as a mother was helping her son survive hardship. But maybe the real responsibility was teaching him what should never be tolerated in the name of love. Her phone buzzed again suddenly. Another message from First National Bank confirming the fund's transfer availability. Beneath it sat a voicemail notification from Attorney Michael Green, the family lawyer who handled Richard's estate. Evelyn listened quietly as his familiar voice filled the room. Evelyn, congratulations on the Montana closing. Also, just a reminder that if you still want to restructure the family trust before next month, we should schedule paperwork soon. Evelyn stared silently at the wall after the message ended. Restructure the family trust. The words settled into her chest slowly. Then, for the first time since arriving at Daniel's house, Evelyn Walker smiled. Not because she felt happy, because clarity had finally replaced grief. And clarity, she realized, could become a very powerful thing. The next morning arrived strangely quiet. The snowstorm had passed overnight, leaving the neighborhood buried beneath bright, white sunlight that reflected through every window in the house. Evelyn woke before everyone else again, but this time she did not feel fragile. Something inside her had settled during the night. Not anger. Anger was loud and exhausting. This felt colder, sharper, like finally putting on glasses after years of blurry vision. She dressed slowly in a soft gray sweater and dark jeans, brushed her silver hair carefully, and applied the same lavender lotion she had used for years. Then she looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She no longer saw an old woman recovering from illness. She saw someone who had spent decades earning respect that others now treated like an optional courtesy. Downstairs, the house already smelled like coffee and toasted bread. Sophie sat at the kitchen island eating cereal while watching cartoons on an iPad. Grandma, she smiled brightly. Mommy says the roads are too icy for school. Evelyn kissed the top of her head gently. Sounds like a good excuse for hot chocolate later. Sophie grinned immediately. Melissa entered the kitchen carrying her phone and car keys. Daniel had to leave early for a client meeting, she announced while barely looking up. Apparently, everybody panics after one bad week in the stock market. Evelyn noticed Melissa's mood seemed unusually upbeat this morning. Relaxed almost, like someone who believed tension had already passed. I am taking Sophie to my mother's for a few hours later, Melissa continued while pouring almond milk into her coffee. You can rest here peacefully. Rest peacefully. The words sounded polite enough, but Evelyn recognized dismissal hidden beneath them now. Melissa wanted the house organized again, controlled again, predictable again. Sophie suddenly looked toward Evelyn with excitement. Grandma, Mommy said maybe we can redo the upstairs bathroom this summer. Melissa smiled proudly. If everything works out financially. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. With the giant bathtub and heated floors. Evelyn stirred sugar slowly into her tea. Heated floors. She remembered the winter Daniel wore 2 pairs of socks because the apartment radiator barely worked. Funny how quickly struggle transformed into entitlement once comfort became permanent. Around 10:30, Melissa drove Sophie to her mother's house, while Evelyn remained home alone. The silence felt peaceful for the first time since arriving. She sat in the living room beside the fireplace with a blanket over her knees and opened her phone again. Attorney Michael Green's voicemail still waited unanswered. Evelyn listened to it a second time. If you still want to restructure the family trust before next month, she stared thoughtfully at the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Daniel smiling proudly beside Melissa. Sophie sitting between them missing one front tooth. Evelyn herself standing near the edge of the photo after being asked to scoot slightly over for better balance. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now even that memory carried a strange sadness. Her phone suddenly buzzed. Daniel. Morning, Mom. Feeling okay today? Evelyn smiled faintly at the message. Daniel still loved her. That was the tragedy of it all. Love existed, but weakness existed beside it. She typed back calmly. Feeling much better today. Hope your meeting goes well. 3 dots appeared immediately as Daniel started replying, then disappeared. Eventually, only one sentence arrived. Thanks for understanding everything lately. Evelyn read the message twice. Understanding everything lately. Such careful language. No mention of Melissa. No acknowledgement of humiliation. Just vague emotional fog where accountability should have lived. Around noon, Evelyn decided to make herself soup. The doctor recommended warm liquids while her lungs healed. As she moved slowly through the kitchen gathering ingredients, she heard the garage door open unexpectedly. Melissa's voice floated inside first. "Put your shoes by the door, Sophie." Apparently, they had returned earlier than planned. Evelyn remained near the stove quietly while their footsteps entered the house from the mudroom hallway behind the kitchen. Then Melissa's voice lowered suddenly, thinking Evelyn could not hear. "My mother agrees with me," Melissa whispered. "You cannot let elderly parents become too dependent or they never leave." Evelyn froze beside the soup pot. Sophie answered innocently, "But Grandma is nice." Melissa laughed softly. "Of course she is. That is not the point." Their footsteps moved closer now. "Then what is the point?" Sophie asked. Melissa sighed patiently, using the tone adults used when teaching children life lessons. "Sometimes people get older and expect their children to take care of everything for them. Money, houses, medical problems. And then the younger family gets stuck." Evelyn gripped the kitchen counter silently. "Is Grandma going to get us stuck?" Sophie whispered. Melissa lowered her voice even more, but every word still reached Evelyn clearly. "Not if your father starts thinking logically instead of emotionally." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. There it was again. Logic, stability, boundaries. People always used clean professional words when trying to justify selfishness. Melissa entered the kitchen a second later and visibly startled after seeing Evelyn standing there quietly beside the stove. "Oh," she said quickly. "You are awake." Evelyn turned calmly toward her. "I was making soup." Melissa recovered fast. She always did. "Good. Warm food helps recovery." Sophie walked over and hugged Evelyn around the waist. "Mommy says old people need extra help." Melissa forced an uncomfortable laugh immediately. "Sophie, go wash your hands before lunch." The little girl ran off. Toward the downstairs bathroom. Silence remained between the two women for several long seconds. Melissa busied herself removing groceries from shopping bags without looking directly at Evelyn. "Children misunderstand conversations sometimes," she said lightly. Evelyn watched her carefully. "No," she answered softly. "Children usually understand more than adults realize." Melissa finally glanced up. For the first time since Evelyn arrived, something defensive appeared in her eyes. Not guilt, fear of being judged. "I think there is some tension happening because everybody is stressed," Melissa said carefully. "Daniel worries about you constantly." Evelyn nodded slightly. "And you worry about what happens if I live too long." Melissa's face lost color instantly. "That is not what I said." "No," Evelyn replied calmly. "It is simply what you meant." Melissa placed a grocery bag onto the counter harder than necessary. "I think you are taking things personally because you have been emotional since the hospital." Evelyn almost smiled. There it was. The oldest strategy in the world. Convince the wounded person their pain is confusion. "Melissa," Evelyn said quietly, "do you know what I learned after 72 years? Melissa crossed her arms silently. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think somebody needs them. The room became very still. Melissa looked away first. Evelyn continued softly. "You were kind to me when you believed I was useful. The moment I looked fragile, your patience disappeared." Melissa inhaled sharply. "That is unfair." Evelyn stepped closer slowly, not angry, not loud, just certain now. "No. What is unfair is treating aging like a character flaw." Melissa's eyes hardened immediately. "I have worked very hard for this life," she said coldly. "I am not ashamed of wanting stability for my daughter." Evelyn studied her for several quiet seconds. Then she nodded slowly like a person finally solving a difficult puzzle. "That is the difference between us," she answered gently. "I spent my life building security for my family. You spend yours protecting yourself from becoming responsible for them." Melissa stared at her speechless. Upstairs, a toilet flushed as Sophie finished washing her hands. The ordinary sound somehow made the silence downstairs feel even heavier. Evelyn turned back toward the stove calmly and stirred her soup. But inside her chest, something final had shifted into place. Not revenge yet. Decision. That night, Evelyn did something she had not done in years. She stopped crying for other people. The realization came quietly while she sat alone in the guest room folding her clothes back into the small overnight bag Daniel packed for her at the hospital. Not because she planned to leave immediately, because suddenly she understood something important. She had spent most of her life making herself smaller to preserve everyone else's comfort. Softer voice, lower expectations, endless patience. Mothers from her generation were taught that love meant sacrifice without limit. But nobody warned them that some people would eventually confuse sacrifice with weakness. Downstairs, she could hear Melissa laughing during a television commercial while Daniel answered work emails from the dining room table. Their lives were already returning to normal around her. The tension had become background noise for them. Temporary discomfort. Something to smooth over politely until routines resumed. But for Evelyn, something permanent had shifted. She carefully zipped her overnight bag closed and looked around the guest room one final time. The pale blue walls. The decorative candles nobody ever lit. The framed inspirational quote Melissa hung beside the dresser that read "Family is everything" in silver cursive letters. Evelyn almost smiled at the irony. Her phone rested on the nightstand beside Richard's old wristwatch, the one she still carried during stressful moments because touching it made her feel less alone. She picked up the watch now and ran her thumb slowly across the scratched leather strap. "You always saw people faster than I did," she whispered softly toward the empty room. Richard would have noticed Melissa years ago. He had a gift for identifying selfishness beneath charm. Evelyn remembered one Christmas dinner shortly after Daniel married Melissa when Richard quietly said, "Afterward, that woman does not love comfort. She loves status." Evelyn argued with him for almost an hour that night. She accused him of being unfair and judgmental. Richard only shrugged calmly and answered, "Time reveals priorities." Time had certainly done that. Around 10 o'clock, Evelyn quietly walked downstairs for water. The house lights were dim now except for the dining room lamp, where Daniel still worked on his laptop surrounded by spreadsheets and financial reports. He looked exhausted, more exhausted than a 38-year-old man should look. Evelyn paused near the kitchen doorway, watching him silently for a moment. Her son had once dreamed about designing video games. Now he spent nights studying investment losses while trying to maintain a lifestyle that seemed to drain the life out of him piece by piece. Daniel finally noticed her standing there. "Hey," he said quietly. "Could not sleep." Evelyn shook her head gently while filling a glass at the sink. "Too much on my mind." Daniel leaned back heavily in his chair. "Yeah, same here." She turned toward him slowly. "You know what worries me most?" Daniel looked up. "What?" Evelyn held the glass carefully in both hands. "Not Melissa." He frowned slightly. "Then what?" "That you have become so used to emotional tension that you mistake it for adulthood." Daniel stared at her silently. Evelyn continued softly. "Peace should not feel like permission. It should feel natural." Daniel rubbed his eyes tiredly. "Mom, every marriage has problems." "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "But healthy marriages do not require one person to constantly disappear emotionally just to keep the other comfortable." Daniel said nothing because deep down he knew exactly what she meant. Evelyn walked over and sat across from him at the table. Financial documents covered the surface everywhere. Mortgage numbers, retirement projections, tuition payments, credit card balances. Daniel noticed her looking. "Things got tighter this year than we expected," he admitted quietly. "Melissa worries because her father lost everything before the divorce. She grew up unstable." Evelyn nodded slowly. Suddenly certain pieces clicked into place. Fear often disguised itself as control. Melissa was terrified of losing security, so she treated people like potential threats to it. But understanding someone's pain did not excuse cruelty caused by it. "Do you love your life?" Evelyn asked gently. Daniel looked genuinely surprised by the question. "What?" "Not your family. Your actual life." Daniel stared at the paperwork spread around him. The silence lasted so long Evelyn almost pitied him. Finally he whispered, "I do not know anymore." That answer hurt her more than Melissa ever could, because she realized Daniel had slowly built a beautiful prison around himself. Nice neighborhood, expensive schools, social expectations, constant pressure, and somewhere inside all that performance, her son had disappeared. Evelyn reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "You do not owe people your exhaustion to prove love," she said softly. Daniel swallowed hard. "Melissa is not evil. I never said she was." Evelyn's voice remained calm. "But there are people who only feel safe when they control the emotional temperature of everyone around them." Daniel looked away immediately. Another truth landing exactly where it should. Upstairs, floorboards creaked softly as Melissa moved around their bedroom. Daniel instinctively glanced upward again. Evelyn noticed. "You are afraid of disappointing her," she said quietly. Daniel laughed weakly under his breath. "You make me sound pathetic." "No," Evelyn answered gently. "I think you became tired." Her son looked suddenly close to tears, though he fought it immediately. "I just wanted a stable life for Sophie." Evelyn smiled sadly. "And somewhere along the way, you started accepting disrespect as the price of stability." The words settled heavily between them. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table, face buried briefly in his hands. "I do not even remember when everything became so tense all the time," he admitted. Evelyn watched him carefully. Then she said something she had not fully admitted even to herself yet. "I am not staying here much longer." Daniel looked up quickly. "Because of Melissa?" Evelyn considered the question. "Because I finally remembered I still have choices." Before Daniel could answer, Melissa's voice suddenly echoed from upstairs. "Daniel, are you coming to bed?" Her tone sounded normal, pleasant even. But Daniel immediately straightened in his chair like a man responding to an alarm. "Coming," he called back automatically. Evelyn felt a strange calm settle over her chest watching that reaction. Not judgment, understanding. Daniel gave her a tired smile before standing. "We will figure this out," he said softly. Evelyn nodded politely, but inside she already knew something he did not. Some relationships were not repaired through conversations. They were revealed through consequences. After Daniel went upstairs, Evelyn remained alone at the dining room table staring at the financial paperwork he left behind accidentally. Mortgage pressure, investment losses, rising expenses. The family was more financially vulnerable than Melissa pretended. Then Evelyn noticed a handwritten note in Melissa's neat cursive attached to one document. "If Evelyn eventually sells the condo too, we can finally pay everything off." Evelyn stared at the sentence without blinking. No hesitation, no shame, just expectation. Her chest tightened briefly, but this time the feeling passed quickly. Because the pain was over now. Pain depended on surprise. And surprise had officially died. Evelyn slowly folded the paper back exactly where she found it. Then she stood, walked upstairs calmly, and closed the guest room door behind her. A few minutes later, she picked up her phone and finally returned attorney Michael Green's call. "Michael," she said quietly after he answered. "I would like to restructure everything immediately." The next morning, Evelyn woke up feeling lighter than she had in months. Not happier, just lighter. Like someone had finally removed a heavy coat she forgot she had been wearing for years. Sunlight poured softly through the guest room curtains while the house remained quiet downstairs. For the first time since arriving after the hospital, she did not feel like a burden waiting for permission to exist. She sat up slowly, breathing carefully as her lungs adjusted to the cold morning air, then reached for her phone on the nightstand. Attorney Michael Green had already sent a message confirming their appointment at 11:30. "We can revise the trust, transfer ownership structures, and update beneficiary documents today if you are certain." Evelyn stared at the word certain for a long moment. Then she typed back one sentence. "I have never been more certain about anything." Downstairs, Melissa stood in the kitchen blending protein powder into a smoothie while Sophie colored at the island counter. Daniel had already left for work again. The tension between the adults now felt strangely muted, almost polite. Evelyn realized something important as she entered the room. Once people sensed they no longer controlled your emotions, their power weakened immediately. "Morning," Melissa said cautiously. Evelyn smiled gently. "Good morning." Sophie brightened instantly. "Grandma, look." She held up a drawing of a beach with palm trees and bright orange sunsets. "I want to live somewhere warm someday." Evelyn studied the picture carefully. "That looks beautiful." Melissa laughed softly while pouring her smoothie into a glass. "We all want to escape winter eventually." Evelyn looked at the drawing again. "Warm ocean, blue skies, freedom. Maybe some people should," she answered quietly. Melissa glanced at her briefly but said nothing. Around 10:30, Evelyn calmly carried her overnight bag downstairs. Melissa looked up immediately from her laptop at the dining table. "Are you leaving already?" she asked, unable to fully hide the surprise in her voice. Evelyn nodded. "I think it is time." Sophie immediately looked disappointed. "But Grandma, I thought you were staying longer." Evelyn walked over and kissed the little girl's forehead gently. Grandma needs to take care of some important things. Sophie wrapped her arms around Evelyn tightly. Will you come back? The question lingered painfully in the air. Evelyn smiled softly. I will always come see you, sweetheart. Melissa stood slowly from the table. Do you need Daniel to drive you home? No, Evelyn answered calmly. I already arranged transportation. Melissa crossed her arms lightly. Well, I hope you know none of this was meant personally. Evelyn almost admired how naturally some people protected themselves from accountability. Melissa, she said gently, people reveal their intentions most clearly through repeated behavior, not explanations afterward. Melissa's face tightened slightly. I think there have been misunderstandings on both sides. Evelyn smiled politely. No, I understand perfectly now. The room became quiet again. Then Sophie suddenly ran upstairs to grab her jacket so she could walk Evelyn outside. The second the child disappeared, Melissa's expression changed. Less warm, more guarded. Daniel has been really upset these past few days, she said carefully. Evelyn adjusted the strap on her bag. Your husband misses peace. Melissa folded her arms tighter. You make me sound heartless. Evelyn looked directly at her. No, I think you became so afraid of losing comfort that you stopped noticing when you hurt people protecting it. Melissa opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Because somewhere deep down, she knew it was true. A minute later, Sophie came running downstairs wearing pink snow boots and a giant scarf. Outside, the air felt painfully cold against Evelyn's recovering lungs, but she welcomed it anyway. The sky looked bright and endless above the snow-covered street. Sophie held her hand tightly while they walked toward the waiting black car parked at the curb. Grandma, Sophie whispered suddenly. Mommy gets nervous about money a lot. Evelyn looked down gently. Adults carry fears they do not always understand. Sophie nodded seriously. But I still like when you visit. That nearly broke Evelyn's composure more than anything else had. She bent carefully and hugged her granddaughter for a long moment. Never let people make you feel difficult for needing love, she whispered softly. Sophie smiled without fully understanding. Children usually understood lessons years later. The driver stepped out to help load Evelyn's bag into the trunk. Melissa stood near the front door watching from a distance with unreadable eyes. Not cruel exactly, just uncomfortable now that consequences had quietly entered the room. Before getting into the car, Evelyn looked back one final time at the large brick house she once imagined helping secure for future generations. Then she calmly closed the car door behind her. During the drive into downtown Arlington, Evelyn stared out the window as winter sunlight flashed across office buildings, coffee shops, and crowded sidewalks. Life moved forward everywhere around her without waiting for anyone's heartbreak. Strangely, she found comfort in that. By 11:30, she sat across from Michael Green inside his law office while he reviewed stacks of paperwork carefully. Michael had known Evelyn and Richard for over 25 years. Gray-haired, precise, quietly compassionate. The kind of lawyer who listened more than he spoke. You are sure about all of this? He asked gently after reading the revised trust instructions. Evelyn nodded calmly. Very. Michael removed his glasses slowly. This is a significant change, Evelyn. I know. Daniel will eventually find out. Evelyn looked down at Richard's wristwatch resting beside the documents. Then maybe he will finally understand the difference between love and access. Michael studied her carefully for a moment. Did something happen? Evelyn smiled faintly. No. Something finally became clear. For the next 2 hours, Evelyn signed documents one after another. Beneficiary changes, asset restructuring, property transfers. The Montana money moved completely into a private retirement account inaccessible to Daniel or Melissa. The family trust was rewritten so Sophie would receive educational support directly at age 25, protected from parental control. Daniel's access disappeared entirely. So did Melissa's expectations. Every signature felt strangely peaceful, not vindictive, protective, toward herself for once. When the final document was complete, Michael slid the folder closed gently. Everything is official now, he said. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Years of emotional weight seemed to leave her chest all at once. Good. Michael hesitated before speaking again. You know, Richard once told me something about you. Evelyn looked up curiously. Michael smiled softly. He said you spent your whole life making sure everybody else landed safely. Evelyn looked down quietly. And what did he say after that? Michael leaned back in his chair. He said one day he hoped you would finally choose yourself too. For a moment, Evelyn could not speak. Then she laughed softly through sudden tears. Not sad tears. Relief. Deep, exhausting relief. An hour later, Evelyn stood on the balcony of a luxury oceanfront retirement condominium in Clearwater Beach, Florida during a virtual property tour with a real estate agent. Blue water stretched endlessly beneath golden sunlight, while white seabirds drifted across the horizon. The condo had floor-to-ceiling windows, 2 bedrooms, a heated pool, and direct beach access. Warm weather year-round. No snow. No tension. No walking on emotional glass every day. The realtor smiled brightly through the video call. It just came on the market yesterday. These units usually sell fast. Evelyn looked out toward the ocean quietly. Then she smiled for the first time in a very long while. I would like to buy it. 3 days later, Evelyn Walker stood barefoot on warm white sand while the Atlantic breeze moved gently through her silver hair. Clearwater Beach looked nothing like Virginia in January. No gray skies. No icy sidewalks. No heavy silence hanging inside expensive houses. Just sunlight dancing across blue water and the distant sound of gulls circling above the shoreline. The retirement condominium purchase had finalized faster than expected because Evelyn paid entirely in cash. After decades of sacrificing every comfort for somebody else's future, she had quietly bought herself peace. The condo overlooked the ocean from the 12th floor, with wide glass windows that turned every sunset into something almost unreal. Evelyn had never owned anything luxurious in her life. She and Richard always chose practical decisions instead. Cheaper hotels, used cars, delayed vacations, extra shifts, college savings, mortgage payments. There was always another responsibility waiting ahead. But now, at 72 years old, Evelyn woke up every morning to sunlight spilling across polished hardwood floors while waves rolled endlessly beyond her balcony. And for the first time in years, her chest no longer felt tight from stress. She was sitting outside a small beachfront cafe sipping tea when her phone finally exploded with missed calls. Daniel. 6 calls in 20 minutes. Then Melissa. Then Daniel again. Evelyn stared calmly at the screen before setting the phone face down beside her untouched blueberry muffin. She already knew why they were calling. Earlier that morning, Michael Green officially mailed copies of the revised trust documentation. By now, Daniel and Melissa understood exactly what happened. The inheritance expectations were gone. The Montana money was gone. The future they quietly counted on had disappeared overnight. Evelyn did not feel guilt. That surprised her most. She expected sadness, regret maybe, but instead she felt something unfamiliar and deeply peaceful. Self-respect. Her phone vibrated again across the cafe table. Daniel. This time she answered. Mom. His voice sounded panicked immediately. Where are you? Evelyn looked out toward the ocean. Florida. Silence. Then confusion. Florida. Yes. What do you mean Florida? Evelyn smiled faintly. I bought a condominium on Clearwater Beach. More silence followed. She could practically hear his brain struggling to rearrange reality fast enough. You bought property? He finally asked. Yesterday. Daniel exhaled sharply. Mom, Michael called me this morning. I assumed he would. He said you changed everything. Evelyn stirred honey slowly into her tea. I did. Daniel's breathing became uneven. You removed me from the trust. There it was. Not, are you okay? Not, why are you alone? Straight to the money. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Even now, the priorities revealed themselves automatically. Yes, she answered calmly. Mom, there has to be some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. Daniel lowered his voice. Melissa is freaking out right now. Evelyn almost laughed softly. Of course she was. Melissa spent years building emotional security around assumptions that no longer existed. I am sorry she feels stressed, Evelyn replied gently. Daniel sounded stunned. Sorry? Mom, this changes everything financially for us. Evelyn looked across the beach where an elderly couple walked hand in hand near the shoreline laughing about something private and ordinary. Interesting, she said quietly. That is almost exactly what Melissa said about me. Daniel fell silent immediately. Evelyn continued softly. Do you remember the night she talked about me becoming a burden? Mom, do you remember the comments about my health? My age? My staying too long? Daniel inhaled shakily. We never meant for things to become like this. No, Evelyn answered. You just allowed them to. Daniel sounded desperate now. Can we please talk about this in person? Evelyn looked toward the ocean again. We are talking. Not like this. Why not? She asked calmly. Because now you finally understand what instability feels like. That sentence hit hard enough. She heard Daniel stop breathing for a second. Mom, are you punishing us? Evelyn thought carefully before answering. No, I am protecting myself. In the background, she suddenly heard Melissa's voice shouting something frantically, then muffled arguing. Daniel lowered the phone slightly while responding to her in a tense whisper. Evelyn caught enough words to understand the panic inside that house now. Mortgage, tuition, taxes, future plans, renovations. All the things Melissa built emotionally around money that was never hers. Daniel returned to the call, sounding exhausted. Melissa thinks you hate her. Evelyn leaned back in her chair slowly. No. If I hated her, I would have stayed and continued pretending. Another long silence. Then Daniel finally asked the question that mattered. Did you ever plan on telling us about the Montana money? Evelyn smiled sadly. I plan to surprise you both next month. Complete silence followed again. Heavy silence this time. The kind that changes people permanently. What? Daniel whispered. $480,000, Evelyn said quietly. I sold your father's land because I wanted Sophie secure and debt-free someday. She heard Daniel sit down hard somewhere on the other end of the line. Mom, his voice cracked completely now. Oh my God. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. I was going to hand you the check during family dinner. Daniel sounded like he might cry. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand something important. Evelyn's voice remained calm. People do not stop being valuable because they age. They do not stop deserving dignity because they become inconvenient. Daniel whispered her name softly, broken now in a way she had never heard before. The night your wife said I smelled like a hospital, Evelyn continued gently. I realized something. You both had already started grieving my usefulness before I was even gone. In the background, Melissa's voice rose louder again. What is she saying? She demanded somewhere nearby. Daniel snapped back at her suddenly. Please stop talking for 1 second. The silence afterward felt explosive. Evelyn almost pitted him. Almost. Mom, Daniel whispered shakily. I am sorry. Evelyn believed him this time. Truly. But sincerity arrived too late sometimes. I know you are, she answered softly. That is what makes this sad instead of simple. Daniel inhaled deeply. Can we fix this? Evelyn looked around the cafe. Palm trees swaying. Sunlight reflecting off water. People laughing freely around her without fear or tension. For the first time in years, her future no longer revolved around surviving somebody else's emotional climate. I do not know yet, she admitted honestly. Daniel started crying quietly then. Not dramatic. Not manipulative. Just exhausted grief from finally recognizing what his silence had cost him. Evelyn let him cry without rescuing him from it. Some lessons needed room to hurt. After a while, Daniel whispered, Sophie misses you. That finally cracked something tender inside Evelyn again. I miss her too. Melissa wants to apologize. Evelyn smiled faintly. Melissa wants stability back. Daniel said nothing because he knew it was true. The ocean breeze moved gently across Evelyn's face while she stared toward the horizon. Take care of yourself, Daniel, she said softly. And stop confusing peace with permission. Then she ended the call before he could answer. Across the cafe patio, a waitress approached carrying fresh coffee for another table. Beautiful day, huh? She smiled warmly. Evelyn looked out at the endless blue water stretching toward the horizon and felt something extraordinary settle into her chest. Not revenge. Freedom. 6 weeks later, Evelyn Walker no longer checked the weather in Virginia. She checked tide schedules instead. Her mornings now began with sunlight spilling across ocean blue walls while seabirds drifted outside her 12th-floor balcony like slow-moving clouds. Every day in Clearwater Beach felt strangely unreal at first, as though she had accidentally stepped into somebody else's retirement dream. Warm air in February, bare feet against polished wood floors. Long walks beside the shoreline without carrying tension in her chest. The doctors said her lungs were healing faster than expected. But Evelyn knew the truth went deeper than medicine. Some illnesses improve the moment certain people stopped standing near your peace. Her condominium slowly transformed into a home over those weeks. Framed photographs lined the hallway. Richard smiling beside the Montana lake. Sophie holding seashells during a childhood vacation. Daniel at 12 years old with freckles across his nose and missing front teeth after a Little League game. Evelyn still loved her son deeply. That was the hardest part. Love did not disappear simply because disappointment arrived. But distance had finally allowed her to see Daniel clearly. He was not cruel. He was weak in the exact places life demanded strength. And weakness inside good people often caused more pain than open malice ever could. Daniel called almost every day now. Sometimes Evelyn answered. Sometimes she let the phone ring quietly beside her tea while waves rolled beyond the balcony. The conversations had changed over the past month. Less panic, more honesty. Daniel admitted the pressure inside the marriage had become unbearable after the trust changes. Melissa blamed him constantly now for letting things get out of control. Evelyn noticed the irony immediately. People who relied on power rarely handled losing it gracefully. One evening, Daniel confessed something that stayed with her long afterward. I think I spent years confusing avoidance with kindness, he admitted quietly over the phone. Evelyn stood barefoot on her balcony, listening to the ocean below. A lot of people do, she answered softly. Especially men raised to keep everyone comfortable. Daniel laughed weakly. I do not even know if Melissa and I like each other anymore. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. That problem existed long before me. Silence followed. Then Daniel whispered something she never expected to hear. I think she loved what our future looked like more than the actual life we built. Evelyn looked out toward the dark water stretching endlessly beneath moonlight. Fear changes people, she said quietly. Some become generous. Others become protective. Daniel inhaled shakily. And what did I become? Evelyn answered honestly. A man who slowly disappeared trying to prevent conflict. He cried quietly after that. Not loudly. Just exhausted tears from finally recognizing how much of himself he surrendered over the years. Evelyn listened without rescuing him emotionally. Parents often made that mistake. They rushed to remove pain before lessons finished teaching. Meanwhile, Melissa never called directly. Not once. She sent 2 long text messages early on apologizing for miscommunications and stress-related reactions, but even those sounded more concerned about consequences than remorse. Evelyn replied politely and briefly. Forgiveness and access were not the same thing anymore. Sophie remained the only person who still felt uncomplicated. Every Sunday evening, Evelyn video called her granddaughter while the child excitedly showed school projects, dance routines, and missing teeth. One afternoon, Sophie asked innocently, Grandma, are rich people happier? Evelyn nearly laughed. Why would you ask that? Sophie shrugged. Mommy says money fixes stress. Evelyn looked carefully at the little girl's serious expression. Money fixes some problems, she answered gently. But kindness fixes loneliness. Sophie thought about that quietly before nodding. I like your beach better than our house anyway. Evelyn smiled warmly. Me too, sweetheart. By early March, Evelyn had built a peaceful routine. Morning walks, fresh fruit from local markets, book clubs with other retirees, sunset dinners near the marina. She even started laughing more easily again. Real laughter. The kind that came from safety instead of politeness. Then one Thursday afternoon, a certified envelope arrived from Virginia addressed in Daniel's handwriting. Evelyn sat at her kitchen counter staring at it for several long seconds before opening it carefully. Inside rested a single folded letter and an old photograph. The photograph nearly stole her breath. It showed Evelyn standing beside Daniel outside the hospital after his childhood asthma surgery 30 years earlier. She looked exhausted in the picture, hair messy, eyes swollen from sleepless nights. But she was smiling down at her son like nothing else in the world mattered more than keeping him safe. On the back of the photo, Daniel had written one sentence in shaky handwriting. I finally remembered who loved me first. Evelyn closed her eyes tightly as emotion rushed painfully through her chest. Then she unfolded the letter slowly. Daniel's words covered both sides of the page in uneven blue ink. He admitted everything. The financial pressure, the emotional exhaustion, the fear of disappointing Melissa, the shame he felt realizing his mother spent years protecting him while he failed to protect her once. One line, near the end, hurt more than the rest. The night Melissa made that comment at dinner, I saw your face change, and I still stayed silent because I was afraid of another argument in my own house. Evelyn read that sentence 3 times. Honest accountability carried a different weight than apologies designed to restore comfort. Then she reached the final paragraph. I do not expect forgiveness right now. I just needed you to know that losing your respect hurt more than losing the money ever could. Evelyn sat motionless for several minutes after finishing the letter. Outside her windows, waves crashed softly against the shoreline, while late afternoon sunlight turned the ocean gold. Eventually she stood, walked slowly onto the balcony, and stared toward the horizon where sky and water blurred together endlessly. She thought about Richard, about sacrifice, about all the years parents quietly gave pieces of themselves away hoping love would return safely someday. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it arrived damaged and late. But maybe late understanding still mattered. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. A new message from Daniel. Sophie has a spring recital in May. She keeps asking if you will come. Evelyn smiled faintly through tears. Then she lifted her phone and took a picture of the sunset spilling across the ocean outside her balcony. Warm light. Calm water. Peace. She sent the photo to Daniel without another word. A minute later, she added one final message beneath it. You noticed when I smelled like a hospital? I just wish you had noticed sooner when I was carrying a broken heart.